overall, the Biden administration will be pragmatic with Mexico, and so I don't view that as having any trouble. I suspect what AMLO is doing more than anything else is avoiding any problems with Trump during the final 2 months of his presidency.
Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is Mexico Centered, a podcast from the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Former Vice President Joe Biden is set to become the 46th President of the United States. The President-elect takes office on January 20th, and among some of the issues he will have to deal with is the binational relationship with Mexico. Sharing a border of close to 2,000 miles and being each other's largest trading partner, the relationship between the United States and Mexico encompasses key policy issues such as immigration, trade, energy, and gun control. Under the administration of President Donald Trump, however, the relationship was also characterized by aggressive rhetoric on one side and damage control on the other. How will a new administration headed by President-elect Joe Biden change the binational relationship? How will Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, approach his relationship with Washington? What policy changes might we see on issues of interest to both countries over the next 4 years? To talk about these matters, I called Mark P. Jones. Mark P. Jones is the Fellow in Political Science at the Baker Institute, the Joseph D. Jamail Chair in Latin American Studies, and a professor in the Department of Political Science at Rice University. Jones also serves as the faculty director of Rice's Master of Global Affairs program. His research focuses on the effect of electoral laws and other political institutions on governance, representation, and voting. Jones is a frequent commentator in local, state, national, and international media on government, politics, and public policy. Here's our conversation. Mark P. Jones, Fellow in Political Science at the Baker Institute, Joseph D. Jamail Chair in Latin American Studies, and Professor in the Department of Political Science at Rice University. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation to be on the podcast.
No, thanks. It's my pleasure.
So last Saturday, on November 7th, the Associated Press and all the major news outlets called a presidential election for former Vice President Joe Biden. So I guess for this conversation, we are talking about the relationship between the United States and Mexico in the context of what seems to be an outgoing Trump administration and an incoming Biden administration starting January of next year. But given the situation, I thought that before we talked about that, I wanted to ask you if you could give us a sense of what's left in this electoral cycle in terms of the election results when they become official, especially given the legal challenges that President Trump is levying against the election.
Well, there really isn't thus far any evidence of widespread or orchestrated fraud. Certainly our use of mail ballots opens up a window for potential fraud, but I think right now we're looking at sort of minor isolated instances of fraud, nothing that would affect the outcome of the overall election. So while the whole legal process needs to run its course, there shouldn't be anything that would actually interfere with the electoral final canvasses occurring in these states during the month of November into early December, depending on the state. Then in mid-December, the Electoral College groups meeting in every state capital and casting their votes, and eventually Joe Biden being a formally elected president of the United States when the U.S. House meets in January of 2021. So right now, I think there's certainty that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. We don't know by exactly how many electors. Right now, it's looking like he's going to be somewhere around 300, but that would depend on a recount in Georgia. But even if it goes adversely for him, he still is president of the United States. I think what's interesting, though, is his relationship with Congress is going to be different from what we would have thought based on some of the public opinion polls prior to the November 3rd election, and that Democrats were quite optimistic that they would have a majority, perhaps a substantial majority in the Senate, somewhere moving from 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats to somewhere maybe closer to 52, 53, 54 Democrats. Right now, Republicans have 50 seats, Democrats have 48 seats, and two runoffs that will take place in Georgia on January 5th will determine between Kelly Loeffler and the Republican, Raphael Warnock, the Democrat, in the special election, and and then the regular election between David Perdue and Joe Ossoff, that will determine whether Republicans continue to control the U.S. Senate with a 52-48 or 51-49 majority, or if Democrats are able to control it with a 50-50 majority and Vice President Kamala Harris casting the tie-breaking vote. All that being said, all that means even if the Democrats get to the 50-50 mark, they still have to have the entire delegation behind whatever they do in order to pass legislation. And something similar happened in the U.S. House. Nancy Pelosi went into this election with 233 Democratic seats from the current Congress and was looking to increase. I think they were projecting at the minimum they would be up at maybe 240. Really optimistically, they were thinking maybe 260. Right now, she's at 218, and it's doubtful Democrats are going to have more than 220, 221. And remember, you need 218 for a majority in the U.S. House. So even the best case scenario for Democrats, you're going to have an extremely narrow majority in the House and the most narrow majority possible in the Senate. Worst case scenario, they're going to have an extremely narrow majority in the House and be in the minority in the Senate, which means depending on what happens in January, Joe Biden can be very, very constrained on what he can do via legislation. And to the extent to which he'll be able to implement his policy agenda, he'll be primarily using things like decrees, regulatory and administrative acts, and sort of enforcing or not enforcing certain rules and regulations. But the legislative route is going to be a difficult one in the best of cases, and it could be a next to impossible one in the worst of cases.
So in terms of diplomatic relations, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador and U.S. President Donald Trump appeared to get along in spite of the inflammatory anti-Mexican rhetoric of President Trump while he was running for president the first time back in 2016, and of his threats even of increasing tariffs or even military intervention if Mexico didn't address immigration and security the way the U.S. wanted. And despite this, they seem to get along just fine. López Obrador recently in the summer traveled to Washington, D.C. and thanked Mr. Trump for his kindness and respect towards Mexico. How do you think he might get along with Joe Biden?
Well, AMLO, like Trump, are both populists, and so they can, even though they sort of sometimes see the world from different angles, their behavior and their approach to politics is very similar. So it's not surprising that they were able to get along relatively well. I would suspect that AMLO, in some respects, will get along with Biden in terms of because the United States will probably ask Mexico to do less in terms of immigration in particular, and that will be, I think, viewed relatively positively by AMLO. Biden's also is likely to be less assertive in keeping the Mexican oil and natural gas industry opened up for U.S. companies than would have been the case with Trump had he continued for 4 more years. I think where AMLO could run into some trouble, though, with Biden is to the extent to which any of his practices are seen as anti-democratic, such as any attempt to reform the Constitution that doesn't strictly follow the rules, or any actions that he engages in that are seen as violating the democratic process in Mexico, whereas the Trump administration would be more likely to turn a blind eye to that. There will be certain segments of the Democratic Party that will not.
So López Obrador or AMLO, unlike other world leaders, refrained from congratulating Joe Biden. And so far, he hasn't done it, saying that he wants to wait until the results are official and all the legal challenges are resolved. In the summer, when he visited Washington, D.C., he declined to meet with then presidential candidate Joe Biden. Perhaps he thought that Trump would win or didn't want to upset Trump. But by not taking a stand, he seems to be taking a stand. Do you think this will hurt Mexico's relationship with the new administration?
No, I don't think so. I mean, overall, the Biden administration will be pragmatic with Mexico, and so I don't view that as having any trouble. I suspect what AMLO is doing more than anything else is avoiding any problems with Trump during the final 2 months of his presidency. So, and in the end, Biden will be president, and AMLO will get along with him, I think, reasonably well. I don't think there's much to be gained from AMLO for intervening in the process. And I think in some ways what a signal AMLO is probably sending as well is something that he's been pretty consistent about, of each country determining its own politics and not meddling in the politics of another country. And so I think AMLO is being consistent in that he's not meddling in U.S. politics by signaling a winner or a loser, just as he would, I think, expect that Joe Biden doesn't meddle or intervene in Mexican politics, trying to pick winners and losers at any point in the future.
Right. So in terms of the policies that matter to both countries, those related to immigration, trade, energy, gun control, how do you think this will change the relationship? It seems like these are the issues that maybe would be the hardest to address, especially without control of the House and Senate. But to talk about immigration a little bit, do you think we're going to see a return to like Obama-era policies, or maybe a change in a new direction? There seems to be this, there's the ever-elusive path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. But a change, for instance, in the Trump administration was the Remain in Mexico program. Do you think we're going to see this just go away?
Yeah, I would expect that we go back to the standard asylum rules, whereby there is no Remain in Mexico or in Guatemala. That is, everybody who comes to the United States is given asylum, and then let the process will play out as it did during the Obama administration. So no longer people staying in other countries. You probably will also see, I would suspect, the Biden administration not pressuring Mexico to stop migration from Central America to the United States the way the Trump administration has, and returning to a set of policies that make it easier to gain asylum and at least provide protections for those who are in the country in a temporary status, either those DACA recipients or for those on TPS, temporary protected status. That is, that those individuals should probably be safer than was the case during Trump, where there was always the potential that they would have to leave if the Trump administration, even though it never followed through on it, went through with some of its threats. So I think from a migration perspective, we're likely to go back to the Obama era during really the second half of the Obama era, not so much the Janet Napolitano portion of it, but the sort of second, more lenient part of the Obama era. As long as migration doesn't get out of control as it did during parts of the Trump administration, where you had lots and lots of undocumented immigrants crossing the border and surrendering themselves. If that starts to occur, the humanitarian crisis will be there again, and I would expect the Biden administration will try to switch up the incentives. But until that actually occurs, I would expect the Biden administration to return to the policies that we saw under President Obama during his second term.
And you think this probably will be done through executive orders? I mean, it seems like that he will only be in office for one term, given his age, and making all these changes or undoing all the changes that Trump made may take time.
Right. Most of the things will be done through executive order or simply through directives that reduce target ICE enforcement and other enforcement to other areas that effectively draw them away. Maybe a greater investment in the DOJ's immigration courts to allow those to be function more smoothly and have much slower delay time. And one of the real problems with the immigration system right now is that we have, for asylum cases, often 2-3 year waits for people to actually get a court date, which is, from a sort of process perspective, is certainly suboptimal.
So López Obrador and Trump, despite being on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, at least in name, right, one being on the left and the other one on the right, as you mentioned, both ran and have pursued kind of a nationalistic agenda. They have this populist style of governing, and for both, kind of in terms of energy, it focused on fossil fuels rather than on clean and sustainable sources of energy. Joe Biden, the Democratic Party, are running on a much different, on the opposite of this, seeking to establish first the U.S. as an ally to the international community and taking climate change as a serious threat. Whereas AMLO, is kind of betting on fossil fuels and oil being the key to the energy policy in Mexico. Do you anticipate any issues as a result of this policy view, since the international community is trying to tackle climate change, Mexico doesn't seem to be on that path so much.
Well, I mean, the advantage for Mexico is the really climate change in some ways is a collective action problem, and so that Mexico can obtain some benefits by being a shirker. That is, if the United States starts to regulate its fracking industry more heavily, doing things that increase the cost of production, then that will both raise the price of energy, of oil that Mexico gets, but also make Mexican oil more competitive. So I would suspect that at least in the short term, and really for any populist such as AMLO, any policy he's thinking about doesn't have anything more than a 3 or most a 9-year time horizon. I would suspect that he's going to double down on fossil fuels and do the most to exploit them in the short to medium term and let other countries essentially reduce their carbon footprint while Mexico takes advantage of what remains of the market for oil and natural gas, both in the country as well as abroad.
And finally, I was thinking about how it seems like with the Biden administration, we'll return to kind of business as usual in terms of the diplomatic relationship between the United States and Mexico. There is some criticism of AMLO and how he's dealt with or failed to deal with President Trump, and especially in terms of immigration. Do you think this may help AMLO? He won't have to get in as much trouble. Although I think he's navigated his relationship with President Trump quite well.
Right. I think the advantage for AMLO is he won't be forced to do some things that alienate some sectors of the left in Mexico, such as cracking down on Central American immigrants and effectively, at least undercutting Mexican sovereignty a little bit by holding U.S. asylum seekers on Mexican soil. So I think for AMLO, the distraction that the Trump administration's directives on immigration have been will be removed. And so that part will be a positive, I think, having Trump gone. He'll lose a kindred spirit in D.C. because Biden's more of a traditional Republican in terms of not capital R, lower R, politician, someone who supports the liberal democratic system and behaves like a standard politician. But I think overall AMLO will be happy in that he no longer has sort of the distraction and of Trump alienating his support among more the intellectual or elite left-wing class in Mexico City.
Right. And he'll be able to focus on domestic issues, which seems to be what he cares most about. Mark P. Jones, Fellow in Political Science at the Baker Institute, Joseph D. Jamail Chair in Latin American Studies, and Professor in the Department of Political Science at Rice University. Thank you for answering these questions.
Oh, thanks. It's been my pleasure.
That was Mark P. Jones. As of November 16, Mexico now registers more than 1 million confirmed cases of coronavirus. The number of deaths is nearing 100,000. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to Mexico Centered. Thanks to Luisa Huacata, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host and do not necessarily reflect those of the center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at usmexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Radio Public, and Spotify. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada. Stay safe, stay healthy, wear a mask, and I will see you next time.